Jim and Edith were part of our church family many years ago in one of the congregations Heidi and I worked with. They were actually a good bit older than us. We were just a young family with kids, and they were in their retirement years. But we just kind of made a connection with Jim and Edith, and they got to be our friends, and we spent a lot of time with them. And I remember having dinner with them one evening, and the subject came up of how they had come to be part of this church I was now working with. Their history went back a long way. And so they told us the story about the very first time they visited this church. They said we were looking for a place to worship, and we came and visited this group, and frankly, they weren't very friendly. We came in, not a lot of people spoke to us. Folks were scurrying around doing various things, and no one really connected with us and visited with us. And so we worshiped with them that Sunday, and we went home and we talked about it, and we agreed. This is a place where we can offer something. And so they threw in their lot with that group of disciples, and on their first Sunday as members, they showed up 30 minutes early, got in with the guy opening the building, and they planted themselves right in the lobby, waiting for people to come. And when folks would come in the door, Jim and Edith would give them a big smile, shake their hand, and welcome them, everybody that came in. And they said over time some other people got to noticing that Jim and Edith were doing that, and they decided that they would come early too. And so a few joined them, and then a few more. And I have to tell you, years later, when Heidi and I visited the group for the first time, we got there, and there were a whole bunch of people in the lobby smiling and shaking our hands when we walked in the door. Over the years that we labored there, I really came to appreciate what I thought was a very important contribution to our efforts to spread the kingdom. But more important than the work they did, I really came to appreciate their spirit that drove them to do it. Can I be real upfront with you about something for a minute? It is easy to complain about things that we see that ought to be better. And trust me, brothers and sisters, it's going to be that way in any church, anywhere. Every family has its challenges and its weaknesses. You go there and stay long enough, you'll find it. And it's easy to see those things and complain about it. It is a far more difficult thing to see a challenge and to take it on and to make a difference. And I think sometimes too many disciples settle for the easier choice and choose to be a complainer. We have been thinking about growing past the season of COVID that we've been through. And candidly, brothers and sisters, over the last 2 years, we have heard a lot of complaining. Talked to a lot of elders that are just weary from all the griping about when the service is going to be scheduled, and are we going to have to wear masks, and how are we going to serve the Lord's Supper, and on and on and on and on. I wanted to share Jim and Edith's story with you tonight, that we would be challenged to have their spirit and to look at challenges, and rather than taking the easier path and complaining, to figure out how we can make a difference. So I know we've got people from other places tonight. We're delighted you've come. I've been watching this rain on radar all day thinking, man, I wonder what that'll do to the crowd. And look at all you folks who've come out tonight. Thank you for doing that. Some of you drove a place. We really do appreciate that here. So if you're part of this church family or part of another church family, the challenge applies. It's still the same. I want us to think about how we can make a difference where we are. And what I've done is I have condensed each idea down to one word, and they all begin with the same letter, and I did that on purpose for one reason. I hope each one will be memorable to us, that it'll stick with us, and we can carry it away from here tonight, maybe ponder it for a day or two, so that we won't just sit around and talk about the better choice. Because that's easy to do too. We can talk about how things ought to be done better, but what I hope we'll do is we'll do something about that, okay? So I've tried in every way to form the lesson up that will help us to act on the things we're going to talk about tonight. Biblically, our work is going to be in the letter of Paul's, particularly at the end of those letters, where Paul often challenges his audience and speaks to them about things that they can do. We'll look at the end of those letters and gain some inspiration as we work through our study tonight. So I'm glad you're here. Hope you're going to be encouraged by the things we talk about. I noticed that you already caught my first word, didn't you? I pushed the button one time too fast. So let me put it back up there again. Act like you're surprised, okay? Here it is. The first word I want you to think about the word is the word participate. If we really want to make a difference where we are, then we need to participate. Now let me illustrate what I want you to see here. When my boys were growing up, they played Little League baseball. And I don't remember most of the games. They're just a faded memory now. But I do remember one in particular. The boys were playing, and there was a mother at the game who was harassing the umpire. I mean, all game long. Have y'all been to a game like that? Usually it's a dad, I know. I was surprised it was the mom too. This time it was the mom. Every call he made that went against her team, she complained loudly about it. That wasn't a strike, she would say. Or he wasn't out, he was saying, and on and on and on. And this went on inning after inning after inning. Frankly, we were all tired of it. What I didn't know is that the umpire was tired of it too. And so toward the end of the game, he made a call she wasn't happy with, and she laid into him again. And this time he threw up his hands and he called time. Turned around and he walked back to the fence that separated the field from the bleachers, and he looked up at the lady and he held up his clicker in his left hand and his chest protector in his right hand, and he said, "Lady, would you like my job?" And for the first time all day, she didn't have anything to say, and neither did anybody else. I mean, just a hush fell over all the stands. We wanted to know what was going to happen next. Man, it was a standoff. He stood there and didn't speak, and she sat there and didn't speak. And he let that moment linger for a long time. And when it was clear she wasn't going to say anything, he turned around and he took his position, and the game continued. And you know, she didn't say anything else the rest of the game. I wasn't surprised by that. I figured that's the way that was going to turn out. You know, Little League baseball games involve two groups of people. There are the participants, right? Those are the little boys and the umpires and the coaches, and they're actually involved in the game on the field. And then there are spectators at a Little League game. That's moms and dads and grandmas and grandpas and coaches who play the team next week, scouting their competition. They're sitting in the game and they're watching. And as long as everybody behaves, that's how Little League is supposed to be. You're supposed to have spectators and you're supposed to have participants, right? Here's the thing, brothers and sisters, I want you to get tonight. That's how you play Little League baseball. That is not what the church is. The church is not supposed to have any spectators. All of us are supposed to be participants. And so at the end of Paul's letter, again and again and again, he's calling people to participate. When you read through the epistles, look for it. For example, Galatians 6 and verse 10. While we have opportunity, he says, let us do good. Titus 3 and verse 14. Our people must learn to devote themselves to doing what is good in order to provide for the urgent needs and not to live unproductive lives, and on and on and on. We could go with examples like that. Think how many times at the end of the letters people are called upon to do something, to be participants. In fact, the truth is, you could just take everything else I'm going to say tonight and put it down under that umbrella, because that's what that is. Everything else we will say is a call to do something, to participate. And what I have found over the last almost 4 decades that I have been preaching is that is the key to a church thriving. Churches thrive when more and more of their people find their spot, their thing that they can do, and get busy participating. Amen. That's what makes a church thrive. But now let me work that backward for you. Because what makes a church die is when it starts looking like a Little League baseball game. You see where that's going? In other words, you have some people who are working and participating, and some people who are just standing back being spectators. The more a church looks like that, brothers and sisters, the less it begins to thrive. Worse yet, sometimes those spectators, sometimes they start acting like the mother at the Little League game, right? Not only are they not doing anything, but they're criticizing the people that are. And sometimes the workers get tired of being criticized, just like that umpire did. And they're ready to throw up their hands and take a seat in the bleachers too. And I can tell you, that's when you die as a church. When you have more and more people watching and fewer people do. Okay, so that's the challenge for me and you tonight. That's what I wanted you to see. Again and again, Scripture calls upon us to participate. And if each of us would do that, if we would get out of the stands and get onto the field and find our place and do our thing, then as a congregation we will begin to thrive. Now, the rest of the points will help us kind of quantify what ways we can participate. Maybe some of them will even surprise you a little bit. But we all need to be doing something. That's a way to make a difference. All right, let me give you a second word to hang on to. The second word I want you to hang on to is the word praise. One of the ways that we can participate is by getting into the business of praise. And I will tell you that I'm also inspired to say that because I see that when I read Paul's letters. You start digging around, especially toward the end of his letters as he's beginning to close them out, and he is forever commending people for the good work that they do, praising somebody for their labors. Philippians is a good example of that. In Philippians 2, in verse 22, he calls Timothy's name and talks about how he had proved his worth in helping to spread the gospel. And then later in that same chapter, in verse 30 of Philippians 2, he talks about Epaphroditus and what a guy this was. This was a guy who nearly lost his life laboring so hard for the kingdom, and Paul commends him. But maybe the most impressive example in Philippians is in chapter 4. In verses 2 and 3, when he's talking about these two women that have a conflict with each other. We'll say more about that in a minute. But the curious thing is that as he's dealing with their problem, he also commends them because they were fellow workers in the kingdom. And so we could go on and on with it. All the times that Paul found an opportunity to praise and commend people for their hard work. Here's the thing I'd like you to consider. I think it is one of the best ways to encourage people, to praise them for their hard work. By the way, that's something else we're encouraged to do. If you look in 1 Thessalonians 5, will you look there with me for a minute? I'm in 1 Thessalonians 5, down in verse 11. Listen to this. 1 Thessalonians 5, verse 11. Therefore, encourage one another and build up one another, just as you are also doing. So there's that call to be an encouragement to others. And then verse 14 of that same chapter, we urge you, brethren, admonish the unruly, encourage the faint-hearted, help the weak, be patient with everyone. And so twice, just in that brief chapter, Paul references this need to encourage one another. What I'm trying to suggest to you is one of the best ways to do that is to look at something good someone is doing and pointing that out. Paul does that with Timothy, does that with Epaphroditus, even with the fussing women. And I think that we need to do that too. Think about the way it makes you feel when someone commends you? Some of you have taught Bible class. How does it feel when a parent comes up afterwards and said, listen, that was a great quarter. I don't know what you're doing in that class, but man, my kid has learned so much. I can't believe the stuff he comes home talking about from Bible class. Thank you for what you do in class. How does that make you feel, ladies? Think about that. Or when someone comes along and says, we are so impressed with your family. You've got all these kids, and you guys are here every service, and you do so much. We just appreciate so much your family and the work that they're doing to help our church. How do you feel when somebody says that? You see? Or when someone comes along and says, listen, I want to thank you for that card you sent me last week. We were really having a bad week. That came at just the right time. And those kinds of words meant so much to us. You know what it makes us want to do? Go home and write another card, right? Or teach another class the next quarter. It encourages us to continue working when we're praised for our efforts. It's one of the best ways to encourage. So, here's a tough question. What tends to come out of your mouth? Do you tend to see what is wrong and vocalize and complain about that? Or is your tendency to see what is good and what is right and to say something about that? Which way do you fall? Am I a complainer? Or am I an encourager? I really had a wake-up call on this a few years ago. I was listening to a friend of mine do a sermon on marriage. And in this sermon, he challenged all of us married people in the audience. He said, I want to challenge you to do a 24-hour criticism fast. He said, for 24 hours, don't criticize your spouse for anything. And I listened to that and thought, well, that's going to be easy. I'm married to a great girl. Y'all already know that. I'm married way over my head. Who just is terrific in every way. I could surely go 24 hours without criticizing my wife. But now here's the deal. You had to really watch everything that you said. And if you messed up and criticized, the 24 hours started over again. I thought, I got this, man. Oh boy, was I wrong about that. I had no idea. I mean, I'd get up in the morning and I'd start to speak and I'm like, you can't criticize. I had no idea how much I was criticizing all the time. It was a terrible experience for me. She loved it. And see, I think that's part of the problem. I don't think we even know that we do it, brothers and sisters. I think sometimes it just becomes so natural, so ritual for us that we just spout off about everything we're unhappy about and it doesn't even dawn on us. I'll tell you what else we don't realize. We don't realize how discouraging it is for other people. Think about how the umpire feels. Gets the call right 90% of the time, but what does he hear about it? Think about the Bible class teacher who labored and labored and labored for a quarter, gave extra time on their weekends to teach a great class, and nobody said anything. Until something happened they were unhappy. You see sometimes why Bible class teachers are like umpires? Ready to say, I've had enough of this. I'm going to take a seat in the stands. I'm going to let somebody else take the heat for me. You know who else feels this way? This isn't even my notes. This is a freebie. I'm going to go freebie. I'm going to just go off on a tangent for a minute. Elders feel that way. I've been listening to them for the last 2 years. Labor, and I had an elder share with me a while back, we labored and labored and labored to figure out what to do with some new problem COVID had created for us, and we finally came up with a decision, and we presented it to the church, and before we could get home, we were loaded with email. These folks were unhappy about this, and these folks were unhappy about that, and they didn't realize it took us 3 days just to figure out if we could agree on this stuff. I can't tell you how many elders and preachers I've talked to over the last 2 years who said, I think I'm just really ready to resign. Guys that get it right the vast majority of the time. How much praise do they get? The thing I love about this contribution is that anybody can do it. Whether you're 12 years old or 80-something years old. If you've been a Christian 2 weeks or 60 years, if you are active or bedridden, everybody can pay attention to the good stuff going on around them and say something about it. I found over the years of doing this thing, folks, that churches thrive in an atmosphere of praise and commendation because it's encouraging. But when we turn on ourselves, it will kill a church. So you want to make a difference where you are? Find the good stuff and say something about it. I'm never saying there isn't a time to criticize and there's never a time to be concerned and to raise complaints that need to be talked about. I'm just trying to suggest, how about we do a whole lot more of that? I think it'll even make our complaints more compelling when we have to do it. So think about that. Think about praise. Number 3, I'm going to give you the word peace. Would you hang on to that? Go to Philippians 4 with me. And I want to return to these 2 ladies we mentioned earlier that were having a problem with each other. Verse 2 of Philippians 4. I urge Euodia and I urge Syntyche to live in harmony in the Lord. Indeed, true companion, I ask you also to help these women who have shared in my struggle in the cause of the gospel, together with Clement also, and the rest of my fellow workers whose names are written in the book of life. Now, I have to tell you, I told the folks yesterday, there are a lot of spots in the Bible that frustrate me because they don't satisfy my curiosity. This is one of those places. I read this and I have so many questions. So maybe I get a little gossip in me, but I wonder what was going on. What happened between these 2 sisters? What is their quarrel about? And why was it necessary for Paul to write and call their names and say, help these ladies get this worked out? I've got all kinds of curiosities here that the Holy Spirit clearly didn't think that I needed to have satisfied. But what we do know is that there are 2 sisters in the church here. And it strikes me that they're important workers, because he mentions that these women shared my struggle in the cause of the gospel. So they are doing important work. And the text says in verse 2 that they are not together, that they're not in harmony with each other. And so that's all we know. And maybe that's all we know because Paul isn't a gossip. What was going on was important enough that Paul instructs the church to help them. They needed to get this fixed. They needed to address whatever this problem was. And so he writes this letter, calling them by name and saying to the church, help them get this worked out. So a couple of things to take away from that. Number 1, it's going to happen. I am fearful that sometimes disciples imagine, because we're all together and trying to follow Jesus and do what the book says, that we're just always supposed to be at peace and we're always supposed to get along with each other. You understand that's not biblical, right? I mean, all the way through the New Testament story, brothers and sisters, from the very beginning, disciples struggled with their relationships. I think it is due in part to the fact that we are such a very diverse collection of people. I mean, look around the room. For some of us, the only thing that connects us to each other is the fact that we both love Jesus. Other than that, we're very, very different people with very, very different preferences and backgrounds and all of that. And so I think it's expected that there are going to be moments of friction. Listen, your own family can't get together without Thanksgiving, without somebody getting mad and going in the other room, right? Listen, the only two people that live in my house are my wife and I. And I know it'll be astonishing to you, but occasionally even the two of us have friction. How are the rest of us going to make it, right? It is a natural thing for churches to have moments of friction and for problems to arise. It's been that way from the very beginning. We shouldn't freak out about that. In fact, let me add, even among key workers and good disciples, these two ladies are important people, and they don't have harmony with each other. It's going to happen. But secondly, we need to see the danger when there is not peace between us. When brothers and sisters are at war with each other, they're not going to be at war with the adversary. It is distracting. And the more and more churches get consumed with internal conflict and bickering, the less and less a church will thrive. In fact, you just mark it down that churches that are dying typically are groups that have a hard time getting along with each other. So we know that's going to be a struggle. We just need to work really, really hard to get it figured out. I remember talking to a friend of mine several years ago who was an elder. This was on Monday. He and I were talking together, and he was telling me about what had happened the day before on Sunday. Right after the evening service, he had been pulled away to a classroom where he was being asked as a shepherd to intervene between two warring sisters. What was just another skirmish in a very, very long conflict between these two sisters. And he was called back to intervene. The meeting that night went on for hours. Into Monday morning. Let me tell you what didn't happen that night. He didn't even get to meet any visitors. He was taken immediately back to this meeting. And there was no opportunity for him to take some new disciples out to dinner and get to know them better, or to go to somebody's house and be encouraged by association with others. In fact, the meeting did not end well. He went home, had little sleep. The next morning, he is exhausted and discouraged, and it's probably one of those moments where he's thinking, maybe it's time for someone else to do this job. I think I'll take a seat in the stand. More churches fill up with that sort of internal infight, the quicker they die. So, two things to take away from that. Number one, next time you're mad about something or mad at someone, pause for 24 hours. And during that period, pray for clear vision, because sometimes we just need to get over stuff and move on. I've been amazed at how often when I make myself pause for 24 hours and sleep on it, I get up the next morning and say, that isn't nearly as big today as it was yesterday. Cooling off kind of helps with that. I'm not saying there are never issues to address, but I am saying sometimes stuff just isn't important enough to distract us. Sometimes I need to get over some stuff and let it go and make peace that way. Secondly, play the role that Paul is urging the Philippians to play here. When there is conflict among brothers and sisters, be the peacemaker. Do not let someone drag you into gossip. You drag them into reconciliation. One of my favorite stories is about an old elder that I knew up in Chicago. His name was Brother Gunchin. And I have been told the story that sometimes Brother Gunchin would have folks come to him and complain about someone else in the congregation. Can you believe what so-and-so said to me or did to me? And they said he had this habit. When somebody would come and complain about somebody else, that he would take this arm and he would, without speaking, loop it inside their arm, and then he would pull them close like this. Then he would say, "Come on, let's go talk to him." And he'd start moving. They said, you should have seen folks fighting to get away from Brother Gunchin. They wanted to gossip. not reconcile. Elmore wasn't having nothing to do with that. Be a peacemaker. What a difference it would make if we were determined not to be part of gossip, but to play the role of peacemaker and help bring people together. Churches need peace, brothers and sisters, if they're going to thrive. And you and I can help that happen. So, when you think about that word and carry it with you, think about the word peace, because we need that so that we can come together and do the work of God. All right, let me give you two more. My fourth word is the word persevere. I learned the need for that pretty early. I moved to Chicago to work with the Joliet Church in 1990. I moved in the summer. That was pretty important. I think if I had interviewed in January, I never would have gone up there because it's ugly cold in the winter up there. But when I got there in July of 1990, that first week began a year-long series of catastrophes. Literally, the first week that I was there, one of our members died. And it was an especially tragic death. A 30-year-old man died from the AIDS virus, which at that time was a brand new thing. That was just kind of becoming an epidemic. And that was the first funeral I ever preached, his funeral. That was week 1. Week 3, about midday, I was standing looking out my back door toward the north because clouds were rolling in. That was not unfamiliar to me. I did grow up in Texas, but these were some major dark, ugly clouds. And then as I'm standing there, I'm talking to one of the elders' wives on the phone about something else, and these sirens start going on. Now, I don't know if y'all have tornado sirens here in Lufkin. We did not have those in Houston. I did not know what that was. And as I'm talking to this elder's wife on the phone, I said, that's kind of weird. There's these sirens going off. And she's like, dude, tornado sirens, get in the basement. And so I did, just ahead of an F5 that came cutting a path right through the middle of our town. And man, we're glad it lifted a mile from our house because it was right on a path for the church building in our house. But it devastated our community, including the home of one of our members that was wiped out by the storm. That was week 3. By the 3rd month, on a Wednesday night, one of our leading men stood up at the end of the service. This is right between the closing announcements and closing prayer. This guy just stood up unannounced, marched up to the pulpit like you've got here, got in the mic and said, this church is in sin and my wife and I can't tolerate it any longer. We're leaving. Man, that was an awkward Wednesday night. One of the elders followed him in the pulpit and said, what sin are you talking of? Why don't you get up here and share? And I'm thinking, oh man, this is not happening. And it did. That was another hour that night. And Heidi and I went home that night and I looked at her and said, you think they'll take us back in Texas? Because I'm ready to go. We didn't baptize anybody that first week. And I was so terribly discouraged. I thought we'd made a mistake. I want to tell you about the people in the church at Joliet. They'd seen a lot of that kind of stuff. And they were tired of it. And they weren't really ready to quit like I was. They were ready to do something different, better. And so they persevered. By the end of the 2nd year, we had baptized 24 people. And that little struggling group began to thrive. And please don't hear me taking any credit for that. Remember, I was ready to leave. They were ready to work. They persevered through the hard times. So let me give you some text to think about. In Galatians chapter 6, do you remember Paul writing this in Galatians 6? Look down in verse 9. Galatians 6 and verse 9. Let us not lose heart in doing good, for in due time we will reap if we do not grow weary. So then, while we have opportunity, Let us do good to all people, and especially to those who are of the household of the faith. You hear him there? Do not lose heart. Satan would like nothing better to take the inevitable setbacks that afflict every congregation and to convince us that we're not passing through a season, that this is the way it's always going to be, it's never going to get better, we'll never turn the corner, and he'd like to get us to throw up our hands and quit. Maybe even to just move to another church somewhere, if there's one close enough, or just to give up on the Lord altogether. Please don't miss the hand of the adversary in that mess. The sad thing is that very often, this is what I learned, very often victory is just on the other side of the next hill. We've got to persevere through the obstacle in front of us. Or to be fair about that, maybe 2 or 3 obstacles in front of us. But we don't grow weary in doing good. Because we will reap if we persevere. So I hope you'll hang on to that word and think about it. Every church is going to go through seasons. Haven't we all been through a season the last 2 years? And sometimes as we move forward, it's a little hard. We're kind of shell-shocked from what we've been through and discouraged. What's the answer to that? Get back to work and push through. Victory's on the other side of the next hill. Last word I want to give you is the word pray. You're stunned to see that on the slide during a sermon, aren't you? In fact, part of me is reluctant even to say that because it just sounds like one of those things that we ought to say. We ought to pray. So I just want you to know, I'm not just throwing that in. I want you to buy into this with me and see the value of it. I'm putting this on the list because when I read Paul's letters, I'm impressed with how often he gives that admonition again and again and again. Let me give you some examples. In writing to the Ephesians, in chapter 6 and verse 18, he urges them to pray. And specifically, he says, I want you to pray for me. And then in Philippians 4 and verse 6, there's that famous passage. Be anxious for nothing, but in everything, by prayer and supplication with thanksgiving, let your requests be made known to God. And then when he writes to the Colossians in chapter 4, verses 2 and 3, be devoted to prayer, keeping alert in it with an attitude of thanksgiving, praying for me too, Paul says. Isn't it interesting that as he tells them to pray, he's always saying, please wrap me into your prayers too. To the Thessalonians in chapter 5 and verse 17, pray without ceasing. And again from the Thessalonians, he sought prayer for his word as well. And on and on and on we can go. So one of the things that is clear to me is that the Apostle Paul had a keen interest in churches praying. And he saw such value in it that he wanted them to pray for him too. I think one of the keys to a church thriving, brothers and sisters, is that we be a praying church. I say that for 2 reasons. Number one, I say it because it works. Prayer makes a difference. We access the power of God to help us with our challenges. I think sometimes we forget that even when we don't know how to get over the next obstacle, that's okay because he knows. The one who is able to do abundantly beyond all that we could think or ask. And secondly, we can all do it. There isn't anybody that can't pray. If you're bedfast, you can pray. So we can do that. Pray every day. And as part of it, pray about this thing you're doing together as a church family. For example, pray that God will bring us together in peace so that we can be united in our efforts. Pray that God will strengthen and comfort and guide our shepherds as they sometimes have to navigate difficult seasons and they get discouraged. Pray for God to bring the lost of this community to this place. You know, our church family started praying that a few months ago. I mean, several of our people just started praying. Bring us the people in this community that need to know you. And I know I'm going to kind of freak you out, folks, but it's been happening. Had a guy show up a few weeks ago. His mama had been nudging him to go back to church. I said, how did you find it your way here? He said, I Googled churches in Spring and yours came up. We baptized him 3 weeks ago. Had another guy show up a few weeks ago. At the invitation, he came down to the front. Had no idea while he was there, but that he was interested in the Lord. And so we talked to him a little bit and set up a Bible study. You know how he ended up in our church building? You'll love this one, Bob, because our church building is right next to the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, too. He went to the wrong building. But he's learning the gospel now. Did I say a minute ago that prayer works? So out of all the people in this place, and in the place where you worship, just pleaded with God. There are people in Lufkin, Texas that need the gospel. Work providentially to bring them here. And get ready to welcome them to the Lord. Because prayer makes a difference. Lots of opportunities for you and I to make a positive difference in the church families that we're part of. I hope you'll do that. On my last Sunday before I moved away, when I went into the church building for the last time on that Sunday morning, Jim and Edith were there in the lobby, welcomed me with a smile and a hug, and we exchanged a few tears as well. My friends shared with me that they continued to station themselves in the lobby week after week after week, even as they aged, and Jim had to prop up on a cane, and sometimes Edith had to just sit on one of the benches because she couldn't stand anymore. They were not standing there last Sunday. Actually, they passed several years ago and they're with the Lord. And during their time, they saw a need, and instead of complaining, they made the harder choice to make a difference. And they did. And I hope on our watch, that's the choice we will make too, to make a difference. Perhaps for someone in the crowd tonight, that's going to begin with a decision. Maybe somebody has not made that first choice to be a follower of Jesus. We don't want to close tonight without encouraging you to respond to God, who from heaven is eagerly waiting for you to decide that you're ready to come back home to Him. Either because you've never made the decision to be a disciple, or maybe you made that decision long ago and you just haven't continued to walk with Him. Whatever your situation, if you're not with the Lord tonight, from heaven He watches longingly for you to make the choice to come back home. I wonder how many times you've broken His heart. Sitting at an occasion like this, nudged in your conscience to do something, and you've resisted and you've held back. He's been disappointed. I hope that you won't disappoint Him tonight. There's a tugging in your heart to come back home to God. Whatever your need is, heaven wants to celebrate, and we want to join and help you in any way that we can. You can let us know by coming down to the front right now, sitting on this bench. Come right now while we stand, while we sing together.
When